I told the chief of police that the Archangel Michael had disarmed the 3 intruders we found unconscious in my sacristy, and the most frightening part is that I wasn't lying. Chief Brody, a good man who has known me since I was a seminarian, just stared. His eyes, usually warm and steady, were clouded with something akin to pity, a look I knew all too well from parishioners struggling with their own private hells. Only this time, I was the one whose sanity was being quietly questioned. The air in the sacristy was thick with the scent of old incense, shattered glass, and a faint acrid smell I couldn't place, ozone perhaps, or something far more ancient. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the cavern of my chest. I could feel the cold sweat beading on my brow, mingling with what felt like a phantom heat that still clung to my skin. He cleared his throat. "Father Michael," he said, his voice gentle, almost too gentle, as if speaking to a child who had seen a ghost. Can you walk me through this again? Walk him through it. How do you walk someone through a miracle, or a divine intervention, or whatever name one dares to give to a force that had ripped through the fabric of my small, ordinary church? I gestured vaguely at the scene, trying to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like frightened birds. 3 notorious local thugs, Silas and his 2 enforcers, lay sprawled on the stone floor, completely insensible. Not dead, no. Brody had checked. Just out. Their eyes were closed, their limbs askew, mouths slightly agape. No visible injuries, no signs of a struggle that involved human hands. Just 3 hardened men, renowned for their brutality, reduced to helpless lumps. A splintered crowbar lay a few feet from the tabernacle door, a grotesque mockery of a sacred key. The ancient heavy oak door of the sacristy stood agape, its hinges groaning, the lock utterly destroyed, hanging by a thread of twisted metal. Pieces of stained glass from the broken window glinted on the floor like scattered jewels, reflecting the harsh glare of Brody's flashlight. This was a scene of violence, of forced entry, of desecration. But then he looked at me, really looked. My cassock was torn, yes, snagged on something in the chaos, but I bore no bruises, no cuts. My hands, trembling still, were unbloodied. And Marco, the boy, pale as altar bread, yes, but otherwise untouched, huddled behind me, clinging to my habit as if to a lifeline. Not a scratch on either of us, not a single mark. Brody's gaze swept from the unconscious men to the splintered crowbar, to my unharmed face, then to Marco, his brow furrowed deeper, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The impossible contradiction hung heavy in the silence, an unspoken question that screamed louder than any shout. I tried to speak, but my throat was parched, constricted. My lungs burned with air that still tasted of ozone and something sharper, something metallic and divine. My mind raced, trying to find words that would not sound like madness. But what else could I say? What other explanation existed? I couldn't explain how in the instant before that crowbar would have split my skull, the very air in this sacred space had turned to something simultaneously arctic and incandescent, how it had become so dense it felt like being submerged in pure pressure, yet vibrated with a silent hum that rattled my bones. I couldn't explain the light, a brilliant, silent flash of white gold that erupted from nowhere, a light that did not illuminate but was illumination itself, a manifestation that had no earthly source. It didn't cast shadows, it consumed them. It didn't just brighten the room, it was the room for a fleeting, terrifying moment, and the force, a force beyond all human comprehension. It was not a wind, it was not a physical blow, it was an absolute power, a will. It had arrived with the silent fury of a celestial hammer and departed in an instant, leaving only wreckage, the smell of ozone, and these 3 violent men rendered utterly senseless without a single human hand being laid upon them. They had screamed, "Chief," not in pain, but in sheer, soul-shattering terror, as if they had looked upon their own judgment. Brody knelt beside Silas, checked his pulse, his breathing, then the next, and the next, all alive, all breathing, all utterly out cold, as if struck by a lightning bolt that left no scorch mark, no singe, no trauma, just silence. And then the faint, disquieting smell of burnt hair where there should have been none, subtly permeating the air. He stood again, slowly, his eyes meeting mine. "Father Michael," he repeated, his voice even softer now, laden with concern. "What happened here?" And I had no other answer. I couldn't. I truly, honestly could not explain it in any other way than the blasphemous, absurd truth I had already uttered. The Archangel Michael had fought by my side. I saw it, I felt it, and I was not insane. This is the impossible event, Chief. This is the truth. And this is where my story must begin, not with certainty but with an absolute, undeniable mystery that still shakes the very foundations of my faith, even as it affirms it. I will tell you everything, but not now, not like this. Chief Brody's gaze, heavy with a mixture of professional concern and personal bewilderment, felt like a physical weight on my shoulders, a pressure I knew I couldn't lift by repeating the impossible truth. But the event of that night, the undeniable miracle, was not a solitary clap of thunder in a clear sky. To comprehend its enormity, to truly understand how the divine could manifest with such thunderous silence and light in our humble sacristy, one must first grasp the quiet, almost imperceptible currents that had been shaping St. Jude's parish for years. It wasn't merely a backdrop, it was the crucible, the very soil in which the seeds of quiet desperation and ultimately of divine intervention were sown. Our St. Jude's, you see, sits in a part of the city the world had largely forgotten. Not a bustling hub of commerce nor a leafy suburb, but a collection of weathered brick homes and small struggling storefronts, their paint peeling like old skin. The steeple of our church, once a proud beacon, now leaned ever so slightly, a testament to time and the relentless wind rather than divine grace. Our parishioners were the salt of the earth, the factory workers whose jobs had vanished, the elderly who remembered a more prosperous time, the immigrant families clinging to hope with a fierce, quiet dignity. They were good people, resilient and generous, but the air around St. Jude's often hummed with a low, almost inaudible thrum of quiet desperation, the kind that settles in the bones, born of unpaid bills, fading dreams, and the slow, grinding erosion of hope. We were a sanctuary, yes, but one whose light often felt dim against the encroaching shadows of urban decay, poverty, and the subtle, insidious creep of hopelessness. It was into this atmosphere that a boy named Marco emerged, not as a symbol of the desperation, but as a vibrant, undeniable counterpoint to it. I remember Marco first as a child of radiant spirit. He was perhaps 12 or 13 when his father, a man named Roberto, first brought him to me. Roberto was a pillar of our small community, a carpenter whose hands, though calloused, were capable of crafting the most delicate carvings for our church's feast days. He carried a quiet strength and an unwavering faith, and Marco, his only son, was his living reflection. The boy had an eager intelligence that sparkled in his dark eyes, a quick, genuine laugh, and a kindness that drew others to him like moths to a flame. He served as an altar boy with an earnestness that was truly beautiful to behold, his small hands carefully tending the chalice and paten, his voice, clear and pure, echoing the responses during Mass. He would spend hours after school helping his father in his workshop, the scent of sawdust and fresh-cut pine clinging to his clothes, a quiet pride in his demeanor. He was, in every sense, a blessing, a boy with a future as bright and open as the morning sky. Then, the unthinkable happened. Roberto, a man in the prime of his life, succumbed to a sudden, virulent illness. It was swift, merciless, and utterly devastating. I remember the day of his funeral, the rain lashing against the stained glass windows, blurring the saints' faces into weeping masks. Marco, then barely 15, stood by his mother's side, his face a canvas of raw, uncomprehending grief. The vibrant spark I had known, the easy laughter, the eager curiosity, it was as if a light had been abruptly extinguished. He became a ghost of himself, a shadow moving through the rectory halls where he once helped me water the plants, or through the sacristy where he'd prepared for Mass. The world, which had once seemed so full of promise, had suddenly snatched away the very anchor of his existence. He was adrift, a fragile boat cast out into a storm-tossed sea without a rudder. In his grief, Marco became terribly vulnerable. The easy camaraderie of old friends felt hollow. The solace of the church, though I offered it freely, seemed distant and ungraspable. He was looking for something, anything, to fill the gaping hole his father's absence had left. And in the forgotten corners of our neighborhood, where the shadows stretched long even at midday, he found it. Not a comfort, but a counterfeit. He fell in with a crew, or rather, they found him. They were led by a man known only as Silas, a name that still sends a shiver down my spine. Silas was not just a common thug. There was a predatory intelligence behind his eyes, a cold, calculating malice that hinted at something deeper, something profoundly unsettling. His business, as far as I could discern, was intimidation, small-time narcotics, and the quiet subjugation of lost souls. He offered Marco a sense of belonging, a twisted form of protection, and the illusion of power that came with operating outside the law. I watched Marco's transformation with a heavy heart, a priest witnessing a slow, agonizing spiritual theft. Week by week, the light in his eyes, once so bright, began to dim, The spark of God's own joy that had once resided there flickered, then recessed, replaced by a hardened, wary glaze. His posture, once open and eager, became guarded. His shoulders slouched as if carrying an invisible burden. The scent of pine and sawdust was replaced by the acrid tang of cheap tobacco and an indefinable grittiness that clung to his clothes and, I felt, to his very spirit. When he spoke, which was less and less frequently, his voice carried a new edge, a cynical weariness that was utterly unsuited for a boy his age. It was a change that cut me to the quick, a living testament to the insidious power of despair and temptation. I spent our afternoons together in the rectory, the late autumn light filtering through the lace curtains, painting muted patterns on the worn carpet. My rectory, a place of quiet contemplation and endless cups of lukewarm tea, became our confessional, though he never formally confessed anything beyond the general weariness of his existence. I didn't press, not yet. My approach was pastoral, gentle, rooted in the belief that grace works through patience and love. I spoke softly, not preaching but listening, truly listening, to the silences between his words. I would share parables, old stories of lost sheep and prodigal sons, not to guilt him, but to remind him of the unwavering mercy of God. I recalled fond memories of his father, Roberto, painting vivid pictures of his kindness, his unwavering devotion, his quiet strength, hoping to rekindle the flame of love and respect that I knew still flickered somewhere within Marco. I spoke of his own inherent worth, his sacred dignity as a child of God, trying to counter the corrosive messages I suspected he was receiving from Silas's crew. But even as I spoke of divine love and human goodness, I could feel a spiritual darkness clinging to him, a coldness that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn chill seeping in through the old windows. It was a pervasive, oppressive coldness that settled deep in my bones when he was near. It was more than just the sorrow of a grieving boy, more than the recklessness of a troubled youth seeking misguided rebellion. There was an otherness to it, a subtle malevolence that felt alien to Marco's innate spirit. It was the presence of something truly insidious, a spiritual blight that seemed to suck the very warmth and hope from the air around him. I saw it in the way his eyes would sometimes dart, as if expecting judgment, or in the way his shoulders would tighten at an unasked question. It was a tangible weight, a cold, almost palpable tendril of malice that I instinctively knew emanated not from Marco himself, but from the orbit he now inhabited. I prayed for him. Oh, how I prayed. My rosary beads grew smooth under the constant friction of my anxious fingers. I prayed for his soul, for his protection, for the light of Christ to pierce through the gathering gloom that was slowly, inexorably engulfing him. I wrestled with my own feelings of helplessness, a shepherd watching one of his flock wander dangerously close to the abyss, my own hands feeling too weak, too old, too human to pull him back. Was this simply a boy making poor choices, or was it a spiritual battle being waged for his very soul, a battle I, in my mortal frailty, was ill-equipped to fight alone? The answer, I began to suspect with a growing sense of dread, was the latter. The shadows were gathering, not just metaphorically but truly, tangibly, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the quiet desperation of St. Jude's and the spiritual struggle for one lost lamb was about to escalate into something far more dangerous, something that would demand a power far greater than my own. The gnawing apprehension that had settled in my soul, a cold, persistent ember of dread, proved itself prophetic. The spiritual battle I had sensed brewing for Marco's very soul, which I, in my mortal frailty, felt so ill-equipped to fight, was indeed about to escalate. It wasn't a slow, quiet descent into despair, as I had perhaps envisioned. It was a sudden, violent eruption, a conflagration ignited by a spark of goodness, a small act of grace that Marco, despite his struggles, had found the courage to perform. He came to me one Tuesday evening, just as the last amber rays of the setting sun were painting the stained glass windows in the rectory parlor with hues of bruised plum and burning gold. His face, usually a mask of weary resignation these past months, was now alive with a fragile mixture of relief and raw terror. He clutched a worn brown paper package to his chest as if it contained his very heart. "Father Michael," he began, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse with emotion. I did it." I waited, my gaze gentle, encouraging. I had learned over many years of hearing confessions and offering counsel that true change often began not with grand pronouncements, but with a hesitant, almost fragile admission. "I took it back," he confessed, his eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears. "The package, from Mrs. Rodriguez, the one Silas told me to deliver to his fence across town. I opened it, Father. It was her late husband's watch, the one with the inscription, And her rosary beads. I saw them when I helped her move last year after he died. They were right there. How could I be a part of this? He held out the package, still sealed, but I knew what he meant. He had intercepted it, recognized the items, and in a moment of profound moral clarity turned away from the path of easy wrongdoing. Mrs. Rodriguez, a widow of quiet dignity and unwavering faith, had been inconsolable when those family heirlooms had been stolen during a recent string of petty burglaries that had plagued our parish. Silas's network, as I had suspected, was far-reaching, even extending its tendrils into the homes of the most vulnerable. "And you returned it to her?" I asked, my heart swelling with a quiet pride that momentarily eclipsed the growing knot of fear in my stomach. Marco nodded vigorously. "Yes. I went to her house. I just left it on her porch, Father. Knocked and ran. I couldn't face her, not after what I almost did." His voice broke. "But I told Silas I lost it. I told him someone jumped me in the alley. I lied, Father. I know it was wrong, but..." I reached across the small scarred oak table that separated us and placed my hand over his, feeling the tremor that ran through him. "You did a brave thing, Marco. A truly good thing. Lying is a sin, yes, but it often stems from fear, and the act of restitution, of returning what was stolen, of protecting an innocent, that is an act of profound courage and grace. God sees your heart." But even as I spoke these words of comfort, a cold dread began to coil around my own heart. I knew Silas. I knew the insidious nature of his influence, the way he operated through fear and intimidation. Marco's act, while morally righteous, was a direct affront to Silas's power, his carefully constructed web of control. It wasn't just a lost package, it was a lost opportunity for profit, a broken chain in his criminal enterprise, and, most damningly, an open challenge to his authority. Marco had not only failed to follow an order, he had actively undermined it. And worse, he had done so under the perceived influence of the Church of Miao. The consequences, I knew, would not be gentle. They began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the first faint tremors before an earthquake. My old sedan, a faithful companion through countless visitations and errands, woke me one morning with a flat tire. A simple inconvenience, I thought, sighing as I knelt to inspect it. But then I saw the slash, a deliberate ragged gash across the sidewall, too precise to be accidental. It was a message, silent yet potent, a whisper of malice in the quiet morning air. I reported it to Officer Miller, a young man from the precinct who still sometimes attended my Sunday Mass. He shook his head, a grim line to his mouth. "Looks deliberate, Father. Anyone you can think of who might hold a grudge?" I merely offered a vague response, unwilling to draw Marco's name into official channels just yet, clinging to the hope that this was an isolated incident. But it was not. The whispers began to follow me, drifting like tendrils of fog from shadowed alleys after evening mass. I would emerge from the church, the echo of the last hymn still lingering in the air, only to feel the weight of unseen eyes, the furtive shuffling of feet, the low guttural murmur of voices that ceased abruptly as I turned. I would catch glimpses of figures melting into the darkness, their faces obscured by the deepening twilight or the brim of a cap. It wasn't just a feeling, it was an atmosphere that began to cling to St. Jude's, a palpable sense of unease that permeated the very air. Parishioners, usually so boisterous and familiar, grew quieter, their smiles more strained. Some avoided my gaze, others offered hurried excuses as they departed, their steps quickening as they left the church grounds. They felt it too, this encroaching shadow, this invisible wall of intimidation that Silas was expertly constructing around our sanctuary. My sleep became fractured, haunted by vague anxieties. I would lie awake in the quiet darkness of the rectory, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building, each sound amplified, twisting into the imagined tread of unwelcome feet, the click of a forced lock. I found myself checking the ancient, flimsy brass lock on the sacristy door more often, my hand lingering on the cold metal, a silent plea rising from my heart for protection I knew this lock could not provide. I spoke with Marco again, trying to gauge the depth of Silas's anger. He was visibly more gaunt, his eyes holding a haunted quality. "He knows, Father," Marco whispered, his voice trembling. "He just knows." He didn't say anything about the package directly, not at first, just stared. And then he told me if I kept consorting with holy men, I'd find myself without a place to sleep, and worse. He said I was weak, that you were twisting my head. He looked at me, a desperate plea in his eyes. "He mentioned you, Father, by name." That confirmed it. The threats were no longer mere harassment. They were targeted, escalating, and centered on me as the perceived obstacle to Silas's control. My heart longed for Marco, caught in this cruel vice, But a flicker of something else began to ignite within me, a stubborn, righteous anger. This wasn't just about a boy and a criminal anymore. This was about the sanctuary, about the sacred space of St. Jude's and what it represented. The true escalation, the moment that stripped away any remaining pretense of mere criminal activity and laid bare the spiritual malice at its core, occurred just a week later. I had opened the church early, as was my custom, to prepare for morning mass, the first shafts of dawn barely piercing the gloom. The air was cool and still, filled with the scent of old wood and beeswax. I moved through the empty pews, feeling the familiar comfort of solitude in God's house, a quiet communion before the day's duties began. As I approached the altar, my steps faltered. A dark, unnatural blotch marred the pristine white of the altar cloth directly in front of the tabernacle. My breath hitched in my throat. It was a dead bird, a small common sparrow, its feathers ruffled and dulled, its tiny neck twisted at an impossible angle. There was no blood, no visible wound, simply the stark, silent horror of its presence. I stared at it, a wave of cold revulsion washing over me, quickly followed by a searing, indignant anger. This was not vandalism. This was a desecration. It was a deliberate act of malice, placed with chilling precision at the very heart of our worship, before the tabernacle where Christ himself dwells. It was a challenge not just to me, but to the sanctity of the Holy Eucharist, to the divine presence in our midst. My hands trembled as I carefully, reverently removed the tiny, lifeless body, wrapping it in a clean linen cloth, before taking it outside for a proper burial in the rectory garden. But the image, the sickening symbolism, remained seared into my mind. A dead bird, a creature of the air, of freedom, now broken and offered as a sacrifice to some unseen, malevolent force, its very placement a direct insult to the living God. It was a message whispered not in shadows, but screamed from the altar itself. I can touch anything. I can defile anything. Even your God cannot protect what is most sacred. That morning, celebrating Mass, I struggled to maintain my composure. My voice, usually clear and steady, wavered as I spoke the words of consecration. I looked out at the small congregation, their faces etched with the familiar weariness of daily life, and my heart ached with a renewed sense of responsibility. How could I protect them, this fragile flock, from the wolf that now so boldly stalked our fold? My own strength felt utterly inadequate. My faith, however, began to harden, to sharpen into a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. This was no longer just about property or influence. This was a battle for the soul of our parish, a defiance of the divine. The final, undeniable threat arrived 2 days later. It wasn't a whisper, or a slashed tire, or a macabre offering. It was a message, delivered with cold, calculating precision, through one of the parish's older, more vulnerable members, Mrs. O'Malley, a sweet, elderly woman who lived alone and depended on the kindness of others. She came to me after evening mass, her face ashen, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold her rosary beads. "Father Michael," she choked out, her voice barely audible, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "Oh, Father, you must listen." I led her to a quiet pew, sat beside her and held her trembling hands. "What is it, Margaret? What troubles you so deeply?" "Silas," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. He stopped me on my way here, outside the church. He looked at me, Father, right into my eyes, and he said to tell you that if you don't hand over that boy, he meant Marco, Father, I know it. By midnight tomorrow, he will burn this church to the ground, with you inside it." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "He said he knew you wouldn't call the police," she continued, her voice breaking. "He said he knows everything. And then he smiled, Father, a terrible smile, like the devil himself." My blood ran cold. The sheer audacity, the brazen evil of it, took my breath away. To threaten a house of God, to threaten lives, through a frightened old woman, it was the epitome of spiritual depravity. He had calculated correctly. He knew my reluctance to involve the police given Marco's fear of their involvement, but his threat, delivered with such cruel certainty, left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. He also said, Mrs. O'Malley added, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible murmur, "that you should remember the dead bird. He said it was just a taste of what he could do." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This was a direct, explicit ultimatum. It was not a request, it was a demand, backed by the promise of ultimate destruction. My heart pounded, a heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I looked around the church, at the flickering votive candles casting soft shadows, at the crucifix hanging above the altar, at the quiet strength of the stained glass saints. This was my home, my sacred trust, the spiritual bedrock of this community, and now it was under direct siege. A profound weariness settled upon me, a physical ache in my old bones. I had spent my life as a priest, tending to souls, offering solace, guiding the lost. I was a man of peace, of prayer, of gentle persuasion. But Silas was a force of pure destructive will, an embodiment of the shadows I had always preached against. He was not interested in dialogue, or compromise, or the spiritual journey of a lost boy. He wanted power, revenge, and the obliteration of anything that stood in his way, especially the light of God. And I, a simple, aging priest, was standing directly in his path. In that moment, a deep, unsettling clarity settled over me. This was no longer a matter of mundane crime or neighborhood disputes. This was a confrontation with something ancient and evil, a force that sought to not just destroy bodies, but to extinguish hope, to defile the sacred, to utterly silence the voice of God in this forgotten corner of the world. Silas's words echoed in my mind, "Turn over the boy, or he would burn the house of God to the ground with us inside it." The choice was stark, terrifying, and yet in the depth of my being I knew there was no choice at all. My solemn word to Marco, my priestly vows, my very faith, demanded that I stand firm. I would not betray a lamb entrusted to my care, nor would I abandon the sanctuary I had sworn to protect. This was the moment where everything converged, where human frailty met divine challenge. I knew then with every fiber of my being that I would need a power far greater than my own, a strength born not of flesh and bone but of heaven itself. The stage was set, not for a confrontation of men, but for a spiritual battle that would test the very foundations of my faith and perhaps the patience of God himself. The very air within the rectory, which hours before had felt like a comforting embrace, now seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension, heavy and expectant. The words Silas had uttered, the chilling promise of fire and desolation, had carved themselves into the quiet corners of my soul, echoing with a malevolent persistence. My earlier resolve, though unshaken in its foundation, now felt like a fragile beacon against an encroaching storm. I paced the worn carpet of my study, the faint light from the street lamps casting long, dancing shadows of my own figure upon the bookshelves laden with theological texts. Each volume, a testament to centuries of faith and wisdom, now seemed to mock my present inadequacy. What good were parables and prayers, I mused, against men who spoke only the language of violence and contempt? The choice was indeed stark, terrifying. I had given my word to Marco, and a priest's word, especially one spoken in the name of sanctuary, is a sacred trust, a bond forged not just between two souls, but between man and God. To abandon Marco would be to abandon my vows, to betray the very essence of what I was called to be. And the church, St. Jude's, my spiritual home for so many decades, was more than just stone and glass. It was a living testament to faith, a shelter for the weary, a house of God where his presence dwelled within the tabernacle. To allow it to be desecrated, to be burned, would be an unimaginable sacrilege, a defeat that would scar not just my parish, but perhaps even my own spirit, irrevocably. I knew with every fiber of my being that I would need a power far greater than my own, a strength born not of flesh and bone, but of heaven itself. The stage was set, not for a confrontation of men, but for a spiritual battle that would test the very foundations of my faith, and perhaps the patience of God himself. I moved to the window, gazing out at the ink-black sky, searching for a star, a sign, anything to pierce the gathering gloom within me. But there was only the vast indifferent expanse and the biting autumn wind that rattled the old panes. It was perhaps an hour or so after midnight, as the world outside St. Jude's seemed to hold its breath in a deep, uneasy slumber, that I heard it, a hesitant, almost tentative knock at the rectory's heavy oak door. My heart, which had been a steady, somber drumbeat against my ribs all evening, now gave a sudden, startled leap. I knew with an instinctive certainty that transcended logic who it would be. This was not the casual caller, nor the late-night parishioner seeking comfort. This was the harbinger of the storm. I moved to the door, my hand pausing on the cold brass knob. A profound stillness settled over me, a quiet grace that often precedes moments of great consequence. I took a deep breath, offered a silent, swift prayer, and opened the door. There, silhouetted against the pale glow of the single street lamp at the corner, stood Marco. But it was not the Marco I knew, the boy whose quiet eyes held a flicker of youthful hope, even amidst his troubles. This Marco was a wraith, a shadow of himself. His usually neatly combed dark hair was disheveled, wild, strands plastered to his forehead with sweat or perhaps tears. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, were reservoirs of unspeakable terror, darting nervously into the darkness behind him, as if a phantom pursued his very steps. His clothes, thin and unsuited for the late autumn chill, were rumpled and stained, as if he had been running, hiding, fighting some unseen battle for hours. A faint tremor ran through his slight frame, visible even through the meager light. "Father Michael," he whispered, his voice thin and raw, barely audible above the sighing wind. It was a plea, a desperate gasp for recognition and mercy, more than a question. My heart ached at the sight of him. All my earlier anxieties, my personal fears, dissipated like smoke. Here was a lost lamb, shivering on the threshold of my sanctuary, pursued by wolves. My duty, my very calling, crystallized in that instant. I reached out, gently but firmly, taking his cold, trembling hand. His skin was like ice. "Marco, my son," I said, my voice softer than I intended, a balm against the harsh night. Come in out of the cold." I drew him inside, closing the heavy door with a quiet click that sounded like a final, definitive barrier against the malevolence of the world outside. The warmth of the rectory, though modest, seemed to envelop him, and I could feel the subtle relaxing of his rigid shoulders as he stepped into the light. I led him to my small sitting room, the room where we had shared so many cups of tea, so many conversations about his father, about choices, about faith. I ushered him onto the worn, comfortable armchair by the fireplace, though no fire was lit. "Sit, Marco. You're safe here," I assured him, my hand resting briefly on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but I hoped it conveyed the unspoken promise of protection, of unconditional acceptance. "Let me get you something warm to drink. Some tea, perhaps." He shook his head, a small violent tremor running through him. "No, Father, I need to tell you everything." His voice caught, choked with emotion. His eyes, now focused on me, were brimming with unshed tears, reflecting a profound shame and fear. I pulled up a chair opposite him, leaning forward, my gaze steady and compassionate, inviting his confession without judgment. "Take your time, my son. Whatever it is, you can tell me. God is here, and so am I." The words seemed to unlock a dam within him. The tears came then, silent at first, tracing hot paths down his grimy cheeks, then escalating into quiet, racking sobs that shook his entire body. I waited, patiently, offering only my presence, a silent anchor in his storm. When the worst of the sobs subsided, replaced by shuddering breaths, he began to speak, his voice raspy, punctuated by gasps for air. "It's Silas, Father," he began, his eyes darting to the closed door as if he expected the man to materialize from the shadows. He knows about the package, and he knows I came to you. He knows you told me to do the right thing." He recounted the story, piece by agonizing piece, the insidious charm of Silas, the initial camaraderie that had lured him into the periphery of the gang, the sense of belonging, of protection that had filled the void left by his father's death, the gradual descent into darker deeds, the casual cruelty, the increasing intimidation. He spoke of the stolen goods, a shipment of electronics, and the creeping guilt that had gnawed at his conscience. It was a simple act, born of despair, but one he had come to deeply regret. He remembered my words, simple parables about honesty and the true riches of the spirit, and the memory of his father's steadfast integrity. In a moment of clarity, a flash of the boy he once was, he had returned the package to a small, struggling electronics shop across town, anonymously, leaving it on their doorstep late one night. An act of profound courage, I realized, given the stakes. But Silas, he explained, was a man who tolerated no insubordination, no perceived weakness, and certainly no losses. The return of the goods had cost him not only money, but face, and in his world, face was everything. "He said I betrayed him, Father, that I betrayed them." Marco's voice cracked. He said it was your fault, that you poisoned my mind. He's been looking for me all day. He sent his men to my mother's house. He knows I'm trying to hide." Then came the truly chilling part, the revelation that sent a cold shiver down my spine, even in the warmth of the room. "He's not just a man, Father," Marco whispered, leaning forward, his voice a strained plea for belief. "He's something else. His eyes, they're dead. There's no light in them, just emptiness. And when he gets angry, Father, it's not just anger. It's cold, like ice. He enjoys hurting people, Father, not just for the money. He likes the fear. He likes to break people. He told me once that the darkness whispers to him, shows him things. He said he would peel my skin from my bones if I ever crossed him, and he said he'd burn down the church with you in it, Father, if I came here." I listened, my expression unwavering, though my mind reeled. Marco's description of Silas resonated with the chilling intuition I had felt when I saw the dead bird on the altar. It was more than mere criminality. It was a profound, soul-deep malice, a spiritual corruption that sought to devour and destroy. This was not just a conflict of wills, but a clash of realms, a tangible manifestation of the darkness I had so often preached against. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and spent, the silence in the room was profound, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading. "Father Michael," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, you said I would be safe here. You promised the church would be a sanctuary." His words, simple and direct, struck me with the force of a physical blow. He was holding me to my word, not just to a vague reassurance, but to the very essence of the vow I had made. He was begging for sanctuary, a concept as old as faith itself, a fundamental promise of the church. My heart swelled with a fierce protective love for this boy, this lost lamb who had dared to seek refuge in the heart of God's house. I reached out, taking both his trembling hands in mine, my grip firm and reassuring. "Marco," I said, my voice rich with conviction, "listen to me carefully. St. Jude's is a sanctuary, and I, as a priest of God, give you my solemn word that this church will be your refuge. No harm will come to you here, not as long as I draw breath, and as long as God stands with us. You did the right thing, my son. You chose the path of light, even when it was difficult. God sees that, and he will protect you." His eyes, still red-rimmed and fearful, searched mine as if seeking confirmation of the truth of my words, and in my gaze I hoped he found not just human reassurance, but a glimpse of the divine promise, the unwavering love of a father who would never abandon his child. He squeezed my hands, a silent, fragile expression of gratitude. "But Father," he said, his brow furrowing with renewed fear, "Silas, he has people everywhere. If we call the police, he'll know. He'll make it worse. He'll hurt my mother, my family. He'll get to me even in jail. His influence, it runs deep. They're afraid of him too." I considered his words, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Intellectually, my first instinct would always be to turn to the authorities, to the systems of justice that society had put in place. But Marco's terror, the raw, unvarnished fear in his eyes, spoke of a truth that perhaps I, in my comfortable rectory, had been shielded from. He was speaking of a darkness that conventional law enforcement might struggle to penetrate, a web of fear and intimidation that could ensnare even those sworn to protect. He truly believed that a formal complaint would not be a shield, but a death warrant, not just for him, but potentially for his family. And knowing the shadows that often crept into the forgotten corners of our city, I could not, in good conscience, dismiss his fears as mere paranoia. Sometimes human systems, for all their good intentions, were simply outmatched by certain evils, or tragically, even compromised. This, then, was the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. We were truly alone, Marco and I, in this ancient house of God, facing an enemy that transcended mere human criminality. My reliance could not be on the arm of the law, nor on any earthly power. It had to be, unequivocally and absolutely, on God alone. This profound isolation, this radical dependence on the divine, was both terrifying and strangely liberating. It stripped away all pretense, all earthly props, leaving only raw faith. "Very well, Marco," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding a fervent rhythm against my ribs. "We will not call the police. We will trust in a higher power to keep you safe. But we must be smart. We must prepare." I stood, pulling him gently to his feet. "Come, the church will be your refuge. We will find a safe place for you there, where you can rest and where you will be hidden." We walked together through the silent rectory, past the crucifix in the hallway, its image of suffering and redemption, a poignant reminder of the trials that often precede triumph. The rectory's door leading directly into the sacristy stood ajar, a sliver of darkness visible beyond. I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill as we approached it. The sacristy was steeped in shadow, the only light filtering in from the single stained glass window high on the wall, depicting St. Jude himself. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of old incense and beeswax. We passed through it, entering the vast, echoing nave of St. Jude's Church. The church at night was a different entity altogether. During the day, it was filled with light and warmth, the vibrant hues of the stained glass windows painting biblical scenes across the pews. But now, in the deepest hours before dawn, it was a cavern of whispering shadows, the flickering sanctuary lamp before the tabernacle, the only source of living light, a tiny, defiant star in a sea of darkness. The silence was immense, broken only by our soft footsteps on the ancient stone floor, each sound magnified, swallowed by the vastness. I led Marco to the main entrance, the great imposing oak doors that had stood sentinel over generations of parishioners. They were thick, sturdy, built to withstand centuries. I reached for the heavy iron bolt, sliding it into place with a resounding clack that echoed through the empty church. Then I turned the key in the ancient brass lock, the mechanism groaning softly in protest. The locks were old, beautiful in their craftsmanship, but I knew with a sinking certainty that they were no match for determined men armed with crowbars and fueled by malice. They were symbolic barriers, certainly, a statement of sacred space but not impregnable fortresses. Their true strength, I knew, lay not in their material, but in the divine protection I prayed they would invoke. "Now, Marco," I said, my voice low, barely a whisper in the echoing space, "we need to find you a place where you will be out of sight, above their reach." My gaze traveled upward towards the choir loft, a gallery tucked away above the main entrance, accessible by a narrow, winding staircase tucked into a shadowy corner of the nave. It was a place seldom used these days, mostly filled with dusty hymn books and forgotten sheet music. It was perfect. "The choir loft," I indicated with a gesture. "You can go up there. Find a quiet corner behind the organ, or nestled amongst the old music stands. Make yourself as comfortable as you can. I will bring you a blanket, and perhaps some water." He nodded, his eyes still wide with apprehension, but a flicker of resolve now mixed with the fear. He understood the gravity of the situation, the necessity of his concealment. He began to move towards the staircase, his steps soft, almost cat-like. As he began his ascent, I stood for a moment, bathed in the faint glow of the sanctuary lamp, which seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The weight of the moment settled upon me, a profound sense of responsibility, but also an unexpected clarity. All the complexities of my life, all the small worries and daily routines had fallen away, leaving only this stark, undeniable truth. I was a priest, called to protect the innocent, to stand as a shepherd before the wolf, and in this moment, that was all that mattered. The night had truly descended, bringing with it not just physical darkness, but a palpable sense of spiritual battle. My old body felt weary, my heart heavy, yet my spirit paradoxically felt alight, a tiny flame of unwavering faith burning within the depths of my being. I felt a sense of quiet preparedness, a readiness to face whatever shadows the night might bring. I knew I had done all that I could, all that was within my human capacity. Now, everything rested in God's hands. The stage was indeed set, and the waiting began. The last vestiges of daylight, a bruised purple and orange, bled slowly from the stained glass windows, painting the ancient nave of St. Jude's in fleeting kaleidoscopic hues. Each pane, depicting a saint or a scene from the Gospels, seemed to pulse with a final dying ember of the day, casting elongated, distorted shadows that danced across the worn wooden pews and stone pillars. I watched them fade, those vibrant colors dissolving into the encroaching twilight, until the only illumination came from the sanctuary lamp, a solitary ruby heart beating softly before the tabernacle, and the cluster of votive candles flickering like a small, defiant galaxy near the statue of our Blessed Mother. Marco was hidden, tucked away in the choir loft, hopefully finding a moment's uneasy slumber amidst the musty hymnals and the silent, sleeping pipes of the organ. I had led him there myself, my hand on his thin shoulder, feeling the tremor that ran through him. His eyes, wide with a terror that transcended childish fear, had mirrored the raw dread I felt twisting in my own gut. I had assured him of God's protection, even as my own heart felt like a trapped bird beating against my ribs. "Rest, my son," I had whispered, a benediction and a desperate plea. "God is watching over us." And then I had descended the creaking stairs, leaving him to the silence, and returned to the profound solitude of the altar. I knelt then, not on a soft kneeler, but directly on the cold, hard marble steps before the high altar, the chill seeping through the thin fabric of my cassock. It was a physical anchoring, a grounding in the ancient stones of this sacred space that had witnessed centuries of prayers, of joy, and of sorrow. The vastness of the empty church seemed to press in on me, amplifying every creak of settling wood, every whisper of the wind against the leaded panes. The silence was not peaceful. It was a hungry, waiting silence, pregnant with the unspoken threat that lurked outside our walls. I felt the profound weight of my helplessness, a crushing burden that settled upon my shoulders like a physical cloak. I was an old man, my hair thinned and silvered, my hands gnarled by time and arthritis. These hands, these very hands, were suited for holding a chalice, for tracing the sign of the cross, for offering the body of Christ to the faithful. They were not made for fighting, not for wielding weapons, not for defending against the brute force of men like Silas and his gang. The thought was a bitter draught, a stark reminder of my mortal frailty. In my youth, perhaps, I might have felt a surge of righteous anger, a desire to stand physically against evil. But age had stripped away such illusions. I understood, with a clarity born of long years in ministry, that my strength lay not in muscle or might, but in something far deeper, far less tangible. My mind replayed Marco's confession, his choked sobs, his stark description of Silas, not just a man, but a darkness. "Father," he had whispered, his voice barely audible, "he doesn't just do bad things. He is bad. It's like there's nothing good left in him, only shadows." And I had recognized the truth in his words. This wasn't merely a dispute over stolen goods. This was something far more insidious, a spiritual malignancy that sought to consume not just a boy's body, but his very soul. Silas represented a force that scoffed at light, that reveled in desecration, that found joy in the destruction of innocence. He was a predator, not just of the streets, but of the spirit. In the face of such malevolence, what recourse did an old priest have? The police, as Marco feared, would likely be too slow, too mired in bureaucracy, too vulnerable to the pervasive influence of such a well-established criminal enterprise. To call them, in Marco's terrified estimation, was to sign his death warrant. So I had made my promise, and now I faced the consequences alone. My promise to Marco was also a promise to God, a vow made in the sanctity of this holy place. My breath hitched, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Fear, raw and visceral, began to creep along my nerves, tightening its icy grip around my heart. It was not a fear of death for myself, not truly. After a lifetime spent preparing for eternity, that particular dread had largely receded. No, this was a fear far more profound. The fear of failing Marco, of failing God, of seeing this sacred space defiled, of witnessing the triumph of darkness over the vulnerable lamb I had sworn to protect. It was a fear of helplessness in the face of absolute evil. Then, instinctively, my right hand sought the familiar smooth beads of my rosary, which I always carried tucked into my pocket. My fingers, stiff with age, found the crucifix, then traced the worn wooden beads, each one a silent prayer, a tangible link to a communion of saints stretching back through time. It was an anchor in the rising tide of dread. And so in my fear, in my profound awareness of my own utter inadequacy, I turned to the only defense I had left: prayer. Not a polite, casual request, but a desperate, focused appeal that welled up from the deepest chambers of my soul, a cry born of both terror and an unshakable, if trembling, faith. I began to pray, not for my own safety, not for an escape from this perilous night, but for the protection of the innocent boy I had sworn to defend. My voice, at first a barely audible whisper, found strength in the hallowed silence, growing steady, though still tinged with the tremor of profound emotion. I prayed for Marco's soul, for his safety, for the light of God to encircle him and shield him from the encroaching shadows. I prayed that Silas and his men, consumed by their darkness, might yet find a flicker of conscience, a moment of grace that would turn them from their destructive path, though even as I prayed it, the thought felt like a distant, improbable hope. But then my prayers sharpened, coalescing into a singular, fervent plea directed to my patron saint, to the one whose very name means, "Who is like God?" Michael the Archangel. I invoked him, not merely as a figure from ancient scripture, but as a living, potent force, a warrior of light in the unending spiritual battle. "Saint Michael the Archangel," I began, the words ancient, hallowed, and now imbued with an urgency I had never before felt. "Defend us in battle." The words rolled off my tongue, each syllable a deliberate act of will, a pouring out of my very spirit. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness behind my eyelids, I pictured him, not as the gentle, contemplative angel often depicted in stained glass, but as the prince of the heavenly host, clad in armor of brilliant light, sword aflame, his foot planted firmly on the neck of the ancient serpent. I pictured him as the defeater of Satan, the one who cast down the rebellious angels from heaven, the ultimate protector against evil. I repeated the prayer, slowly at first, then with increasing fervor, the rhythmic cadence a balm to my agitated soul, yet also a tightening of my spiritual resolve. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. Each time I uttered the words, I imagined them as a shield, a barrier forming around the church, around Marco in the loft, around my own trembling heart. I wasn't just reciting a rote prayer. I was waging spiritual warfare with the only weapon I possessed. My mind wandered to the scripture passages describing Michael, his struggle with the dragon, his defense of God's people, his unwavering loyalty. I clung to these images, these promises of divine intervention, as a drowning man clings to a spar. The weight of the night pressed down, growing colder, darker. I imagined Silas and his men outside, perhaps reconnoitering, perhaps preparing to breach the final sanctuary of the church. I could almost feel their malicious intent, a palpable pressure against the ancient doors, a whisper of dark energy slithering through the cracks in the stone. It was a spiritual cold, more chilling than any autumn breeze. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. The words became a mantra, a heartbeat, a desperate plea echoing in the vast, empty church. I poured every ounce of my will, every particle of my faith into that prayer. My throat grew hoarse, my knees ached on the cold marble, but I did not stop. The world outside, the world of human fear and violence, faded to a distant hum. Only the prayer, only the Archangel, only God's protective hand truly mattered in that moment. I thought of the long lineage of priests, of saints and martyrs, who had faced similar darkness, similar threats, and had found their strength not in their own might, but in the unwavering power of the divine. I was but a small, humble link in that chain, but I would not break. I would stand my ground, spiritually speaking, and fight with the only weapons God had given me. My gaze drifted to the tabernacle, where the reserved sacrament lay enshrined, the true presence of Christ, humble and hidden, yet the very source of all power. In that small golden box, God himself resided, and I, his unworthy servant, was here, praying to his great archangel, begging for his intervention. It felt both impossibly audacious and utterly inevitable. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. The darkness outside was now complete, impenetrable. The votive candles, once so fragile, seemed to burn with a fierce intensity, their small flames dancing as if in response to my fervent prayers. The air itself seemed to thicken, to hum with an unseen energy, a shift from mere physical cold to something spiritual and profound. Was it my imagination, born of fear and desperation, or was something truly stirring in the unseen realms, roused by the ancient, potent invocation? I prayed until my voice was a raw whisper, until my mind felt stretched thin, yet remarkably clear. The fear was still there and not in my gut, but it was now tempered by a growing sense of resolute peace, a conviction that I had done all I could and that the outcome was now truly in hands far more capable than my own. The waiting was still agonizing, the threat still imminent, but I was no longer alone in my vigil. I had invoked a greater power, and in the profound stillness of that night, I held on to the fragile yet unyielding hope that I had been heard. The battle had been joined not with fists or weapons, but with faith, fear, and the desperate, unwavering call to the Prince of the heavenly host. And now I would wait for his answer. The answer I had prayed for, the one I had waited for with such profound, trembling hope, arrived not with a gentle whisper or a comforting warmth, but with a sound like a gunshot in the still, sacred air. It was a violent, unholy cacophony, the sharp, metallic clang of forced entry, followed by the sickening shatter of glass. The sacristy window, a small, unassuming pane that usually offered a glimpse of the moonlit garden, now lay in 1,000 glittering shards on the vestry floor. They were in. The sound tore through the quietude of my vigil, a brutal counterpoint to the soft murmurs of my rosary beads. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every nerve in my old body snapped to attention, the fragile peace I had cultivated through prayer momentarily dissolving into raw, primal fear. My eyes, accustomed to the dimness, strained towards the sacristy door, which now stood ajar, a blacker void within the already deep shadows of the church. Then came the voices, low and guttural at first, laced with a casual brutality that made my stomach clench. Harsh whispers, like serpents rustling through dry leaves, slithered through the holy space, defiling its solemn silence. I heard the unmistakable scrape of heavy boots on the polished stone floor, each step a deliberate desecration. The beam of a flashlight, crude and invasive, cut through the darkness, dancing irreverently across the stations of the cross, the baptismal font, the statues of saints, seeking, searching. They moved with an arrogant certainty, as if this sanctuary, this house of God, were nothing more than an empty warehouse for their malevolent hunt. I heard their contempt, their crude jests, their violence palpable even in their low tones as they sought Marco. I knew my moment had come. There was no more waiting, no more hoping from a distance. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it drew courage from the very stones of the altar, I rose. My old joints protested, but my spirit felt surprisingly unburdened, focused. I was an old man, yes, my hands gnarled and frail, my body a vessel long past its prime for any earthly battle. But I was also a priest, standing in the very heart of the sanctuary, before the high altar, where the Lord truly dwells. I had nothing but my cassock, threadbare and unassuming, and my faith, which in this moment felt like an impenetrable shield. I met them at the threshold of the sanctuary proper, where the altar rail marked the beginning of the most hallowed ground. The three figures stopped abruptly, their flashlights freezing on me. Silas stood in the center, flanked by his two henchmen, whose faces were grim masks of brutish determination. Silas's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile, a predator observing its cornered prey. His eyes, in the harsh glare of the flashlight, gleamed with a cold, triumphant hatred that was truly chilling. A darkness I recognized from Marco's terrified descriptions, a darkness that had nothing to do with this world and everything to do with another. He held a crowbar, its wicked curve catching the artificial light, a primitive instrument of violence held with a horrifying confidence. "Well, well, Father Michael," Silas drawled, his voice a low, gravelly sneer that echoed too loudly in the sacred space. "Look at you. Standing guard over an empty nest, I presume?" His men snickered, their laughter a discordant desecration. My heart ached, not for myself, but for the profound disrespect shown to this place, to God. I felt a surge of righteous indignation, a quiet fire igniting within my soul. Silas took a step forward, raising the crowbar slightly, a subtle threat. "Step aside, old man, we don't want to hurt you, just the boy." "He is under God's protection here," I stated, my voice surprisingly steady, though I could feel a tremor starting deep within me. "And I am his priest. I will not move." Silas laughed then, a short, contemptuous bark. He shoved me aside with unexpected force, catching me off balance. I stumbled, my old bones jarring, but managed to catch myself before falling. The indignity of the act, the sheer disregard for my person and my sacred office, stung more than any physical pain. But before I could even fully register the sharp protest of my hip, I straightened, my gaze fixed on the tabernacle, drawing strength from the silent presence within. I knew I could not falter now. Silas gestured curtly to his men. "Go on. He's got to be in the choir loft. Get him." The two men moved past me, their heavy steps echoing towards the stairs that led to the choir loft, where Marco, my lost lamb, was hidden. My heart leaped into my throat. This was it, the final stand. I could not let them pass. I stood in their path again, my body now a barrier, frail though it was. I stretched out my hands, not in an act of aggression, but of desperate supplication, a silent plea. My breath caught in my throat, but the prayer, the ancient potent invocation, flowed from my lips, a shield against the encroaching darkness. My voice was shaking now, a fragile whisper against the impending storm, but it was resolute, unwavering in its conviction. "Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil." I repeated it, louder this time, my gaze locked on Silas, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He raised the crowbar high above his head, the metal glinting menacingly. His eyes, no longer merely scornful, burned with a furious hatred that seemed to transcend the human, a primal evil that sought to extinguish the light. His lips peeled back in a snarl, revealing teeth clenched in a hideous grimace. "Your God can't help you now, old man." The crowbar began its descent. "Your God can't help you now, old man." The crowbar began its descent. It was a moment suspended outside of time, etched into the very fabric of my being. I remember the glint of metal against the faint light filtering from the sacristy doorway, the fierce triumph in Silas's eyes, the cold dread that pierced my soul. I braced myself not for the impact but for the finality of it, my heart crying out one last silent iteration of the Archangel's prayer. And then everything changed. The air, which had moments before been merely cold with the autumn night and the chill of fear, instantly became thick, heavy, and charged with an impossible energy. It pressed in, not suffocating, but brimming with a vibrant, potent force that made the very stones of St. Jude's seem to hum. My breath caught, not from fear, but from a sudden, profound awareness of something utterly beyond the natural. A brilliant, silent flash of white gold light erupted from the space between me and Silas. It wasn't a light that illuminated the sanctuary, no, it was illumination itself, a pure, unadulterated radiance that had no discernible source. It wasn't a bulb, a flame, or even a phenomenon of nature. It was a manifestation, a tearing of the veil between worlds. It burned with an intensity that should have blinded, yet it pierced not my eyes, but the very core of my being, revealing rather than obscuring. In that blinding instant, I didn't see with my eyes, but I felt with every fiber of my spirit a presence of absolute power and unwavering authority standing before me. It was immense, ancient, and utterly unwavering. A being of pure, righteous force, its essence vibrating with a resolve that silenced all doubt, all fear, all earthly concerns. Its arrival was like the tolling of a final bell, a declaration that the time for wickedness was over, that a line had been drawn that could not be crossed. My prayer, whispered in desperation, had been answered with a thunderclap of divine presence. Silas and his two henchmen, who moments before had been hulking figures of intimidation, crumpled under the weight of this unseen majesty. They didn't cry out in physical pain, but in a sheer soul-shattering terror, a primal scream that tore from their throats. It was the sound of beings facing something so pure, so holy, so utterly unassailable, that it stripped away every layer of their hardened malice, leaving them utterly exposed. They were not merely afraid, they were looking upon their own judgment, and the horror of that recognition was infinite. The crowbar, which had been poised for violence, flew from Silas's hand as if struck by an invisible hammer, clattering loudly against the marble floor, its sound sharp and alien in the sudden, overwhelming silence. The three men were thrown backward, not by a physical blow, but as if by a thunderous, invisible wave. Their bodies launched through the air with a terrifying swiftness, landing in a heap near the baptismal font, a tangled mess of limbs and fabric. One moment screaming, eyes wide with incomprehensible dread. The next they were instantly unconscious, utterly still, like marionettes, whose strings had been cut by an unseen hand. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light and the formidable presence were gone. The sanctuary was plunged back into the dimness, broken only by the faint cold glow from the sacristy. But it wasn't the same dimness. The silence that descended was profound, deep, a sacred hush that absorbed even the echoes of their screams. The air, though no longer charged with that impossible energy, carried a faint, almost metallic scent, like the aftermath of a distant lightning strike, the unmistakable smell of ozone. I stood there, trembling, my legs weak, yet my spirit alight. My eyes, though they had seen nothing tangible, perceived everything. The crowbar lay innocently on the floor. Silas and his men were a heap by the font, and I, an old priest, stood unharmed before the altar. The memory of white gold light burned into my soul. There was no doubt, no room for rationalization, no explanation that human words could ever encompass. Only an absolute, unshakable certainty. We had not been alone. The prayers of a frightened old man had indeed been heard, and the Prince of the heavenly host had answered. The shrill wail of sirens, faint then insistent, pierced the hallowed quiet of St. Jude's. Chief Brodie and his officers arrived with the careful reluctance of men accustomed to the city's grim reality, yet utterly unprepared for the unreality awaiting them. I remember Chief Brodie's gaze, a mix of weary compassion and stark bewilderment, sweeping over the scene. Splintered glass, the crowbar near the tabernacle, and the three notorious thugs, Silas among them, sprawled lifelessly by the baptismal font. He knew these men. Here they were, subdued, unblemished, in the presence of an old priest and a frightened boy. My earlier words about the archangel must have returned to him, hanging in the air like an impossible truth. The intruders, roused and taken into custody, were transformed. Their hardened criminal resolve was utterly vaporized, replaced by a visceral terror no human threat could inspire. A terrible angel, one rasped, eyes wide and unseeing. A light like a sword, whispered another, hands trembling uncontrollably, not with withdrawal, but an inner tremor. Silas, the coldest, simply wept, his arrogance replaced by an agonizing fear of a justice far greater than any earthly court. In those moments their redemption, or at least its terrifying inception, began. They confessed to everything, not with coercion, but an urgent, desperate need to unburden their souls. For me, that night was more than an event. It was a profound clarification. Before, the eternal struggle between good and evil often felt like a grand metaphor. But on that night I learned, with an undeniable certainty seared into my being, that the Great War is not a metaphor at all. It is utterly terrifyingly real. And while our prayers, whispered in the dim quiet of a forgotten church, may seem small, the response is sometimes a thunderclap that shakes the world's foundations. It is a reminder that the spiritual realm is not an abstract concept, but a vibrant, active reality, woven intimately into our lives. St. Jude's Parish, once a target of shadows, was never threatened again in that manner. The very air around it seemed to hum with a quiet sanctity, a silent testament to the protection it had received. And Marco, my lost lamb, found not just sanctuary, but a new path. The experience ignited in him a burning faith, a desire to serve. He is now studying to become a deacon, his eyes alight with gentle zeal, a shepherd in training, leading others toward the light he himself witnessed. I will carry the memory of that night forever, not as a trauma, but as an unspeakable gift. It is a stark, glorious reminder that we are never, ever alone in our fight against the shadows. Even in our deepest helplessness, even when the world seems to abandon us, forces of divine light and love stand ready to defend us. All we need is to ask, with a heart open in faith, and trust that the Prince of the heavenly host stands ever vigilant, ever ready to answer the call. The mystery of God's intervention remains, a holy secret etched into St. Jude's, but its message is clear. Hope endures, and faith, however small, can move mountains, or indeed conjure an archangel.